Good afternoon. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual panel discussion on A City for All, Achieving More Inclusive Municipal Governance in Toronto. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Although this event is virtual, and I realize that everyone is in a different location, perhaps even in a different country, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Senecas, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to start by thanking the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for everything they did to make this happen today, Thomas Hatchard and Ahmed Kawaji, and the event staff and technical staff at the Munk School. And you know they're doing double duty these days with all of these remote events. Finally, I would like to give special thanks to our moderator, Brittany Andrew-Amofah, who I will introduce to you soon, panelist Patricia Wood, and IMFG fellow Alexandra Flynn, whose opinion piece in the Globe and Mail helped spark the idea for this event today, and they also helped shape it. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFGToronto. Recent protests against police brutality and anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism have highlighted the systemic racism in the city's key institutions. On top of that, COVID-19 has disproportionately affected racialized residents. These events have sparked many important conversations about policy gaps, such as the need for more race-based data, and policy solutions, such as calls to defund the police. But they also underline the fact that those most affected by these policy changes, those who are most dependent on public services, and those who are most vulnerable to abuse and racism, are those that are least heard when the decisions are made. So that's what brings us to our event today. We're asking a number of questions. What changes do we need to make to ensure all Torontonians are meaningfully engaged in the city's decision-making? How can the voices of racialized, newcomer, and Indigenous residents be firmly integrated into the city's governance structures? Today's panel really follows on a conversation we hosted last year, pre-COVID, on the role of consultations in developing good public policy. We produced an IMFG report based on that event, which was released yesterday, and you can find it on our website. So let me now take a few minutes to introduce the panel to you. Their bios are on our website, so I'm not going to go into great detail. Our moderator for today is Brittany Andrew-Amofah. Brittany is the Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Broadbent Institute, where she is responsible for assisting with setting the research and policy direction and managing the Broadbent Institute's fellow program. Turning to our speakers, Heather Dories is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where she is cross-appointed to the Department of Geography and Planning and the Centre for Indigenous Studies. Her research is focused on the relationship between urban planning and settler colonialism, as well as the application of Indigenous knowledge systems in planning contexts. Anthony Morgan is a lawyer and the manager of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, CABR unit. This unit is responsible for the implementation of the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. Devika Shaw is Executive Director of Social Planning Toronto and has held past positions with the World Wildlife Fund of Canada, Pembina Institute, York University, and KCI Philanthropy. Patricia Wood, who's been on panels before at IMFG, is a professor of geography at York University and a co-founder of its City Institute. With IMFG fellow Alex Flynn, she is conducting international comparative research into urban governance and public consultation about the future of Toronto's governance structures. So the way we're going to run today is we'll start with some opening remarks from our moderator, Brittany, and that will be followed by a panel discussion. We will leave some time for audience questions at the end. You can ask your questions, and I know you all know how to do this using Zoom's Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom of the screen. Please welcome Brittany Andrew-Amofah and the panel. Over to you, Brittany.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Enid. And thank you so much for everybody who is in attendance today. I just want to take a few moments, to provide some context for this conversation and to actually get everybody on board as to why we're having this conversation in this very moment, at this moment in time. So we all know, I think many of us who are attending this panel discussion right now are really well versed in what I would say the main issues or the huge policy issues that are impacting Toronto and municipalities across this country. A lot of these issues have been exacerbated since COVID. We've seen housing affordability come to the forefront once again, especially as many folks have lost hours in employment or even their jobs throughout this time. We've seen those who are precariously housed face even more vulnerable situations than they were doing so pre-COVID. We've seen the COVID crisis within our shelter system, and then we've also had robust conversations around the state of public transit and a number of public services that exist in the city that is funded by our municipality. But also what I want to do is add to this conversation is provide the lens of the deteriorating state of representation within this city. And this dates back from 1998 when Toronto was amalgamated, to 2003 when a solution was attempted to be proposed through the City of Toronto Act, and then to 2018 where we saw the reduction of Toronto City Council, which again forced the conversation around the state of representation, how we can influence policy decisions or the ability for residents within the city to influence policy decisions, and how do we ensure that we're achieving the sort of outcomes that produce or actually reduce inequities within this city. And just to kind of circle us back to the reason why, or the moment that we're in now, as we know, racial disparities is a huge issue that has been occurring in Toronto, and calls for defunding the police, again, are forcing us to reconsider our plans around public safety and how we're using the revenue that's coming into the city to fund services. So before I pass it over to the panel, I want us to kind of think through the working definition we have at hand as it relates to the term of inclusive governance. So this is a definition that's constantly evolving. It's a definition that we would like to introduce into the, I would say, municipal policy landscape to help us think through ways that we can, I would say, provide solutions to some of the pressing issues that are existing in this city. So when we're talking about inclusive governance, we're defining it as integrating participatory processes into our municipal governance process in order to strengthen policy ideas and solutions. When we talk about municipal governance, we're also talking about how do we bring in community voices, particularly those who are most marginalized, into our governance and decision-making processes. And then lastly, it's a model of governance that works to address inequities and unequal access to political power and influence. So how do we take our existing model of governance and kind of reshape it, reform it, or even take it apart and rebuild it back together? How do we take that existing model and expand it and allow for greater participation from all of those who live in the city in order to produce what I am referring to as more equitable outcomes? So thank you so much for everybody for attending. And again, please, we will be leaving questions for Q&A at the end of this conversation. So if there's anything that comes to your mind, please feel free to use that function. So the first question I want to pass over to our panelists is, how does your work, and I'm going to ask Tricia this question first, how does your work relate to the push for more inclusive governance, working within an academic institution, but also coming from a more community building, community lens background? How does your work work towards, this term or this working definition that we're seeking to solve?
Thanks, Brittany. Generally speaking, I study citizenship and not the formal status or the rights, but in fact the gap between the expectation or the promise of that status or what's on paper and what people's rights and practices are, you know, in their everyday lives in practice. And that gap is quite large for some communities and less so for others. And so right now, with Alexandra Flynn and also with our moderator, Brittany, I have a research project on renewing governance specifically in Toronto. And it started right after Bill 5 and the reduction of city council. But the idea of it is that Bill 5 is really only the latest problem. The hope is that it created an opportunity, possibly, to open up these questions about local governance. But the premise of the project is the central failure of existing structures to be properly inclusive in the city of Toronto, that was an already existing situation that was exacerbated by Bill 5. And then the research is trying to identify what we can learn from communities themselves, from pre-existing academic research, and also from practices in other Canadian cities and cities around the world to improve governance. And in keeping with the definition that you introduced, it's a very broad understanding of governance. It includes formal and informal structures and practices of governance, and it includes both the way residents participate in decision-making processes, but also how residents receive the services, broadly speaking, to which they're entitled from local governments.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Heather. How does your work contribute to the overall goal of achieving inclusive governance?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me here today. So I work at the intersection of Indigenous studies and urban planning, and my research is framed by a few basic questions. First, just generally, how are urban planning and development implicated in processes of colonial dispossession? And how do they enact forms of systemic racism, both within the formal planning system, but also in other forms of government, as Patricia was mentioning, informal modes of government that might relate to planning systems. And I think this is an important question because planning is often imagined as a technical rather than a political practice. And in particular, it's not imagined as part of the structures of democratic governance that need to be involved in discussions related to decolonization, reconciliation, and anti-racism. And yet history has shown that planning has a really tremendous capacity to manage Indigenous territories, to impact Aboriginal and treaty rights. And from Oka to Caledonia, many of the major flashpoints between Indigenous peoples and Canada have been precipitated by municipal planning and governance decisions. So this is a really important area of governance to be thinking about. So that's kind of the diagnosis aspect of my research. But the other thing I'm really interested in thinking about is what it means to make planning and urbanism a target of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle. And I think civil rights movements, anti-racist movements really have a lot to teach us in this regard, which is why I'm so glad that Enid mentioned these current struggles that are taking place at this moment, because I think they're really important for informing these discussions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And Devika?
Thank you for having me here. It's great to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects. So Social Planning Toronto's mandate is to advance social justice and to create an equitable and inclusive society for all residents. And one of our key strategies for doing this is to support frontline agencies and grassroots groups in being able to plug in to advocacy and engagement opportunities, and by connecting the dots between action in different neighborhoods. And so often that means playing the role of navigating the bureaucracy in City Hall, figuring out deadlines and processes, and then helping others to participate. So for example, last year during the housing TO consultations, we worked with grassroots leaders and then together facilitated over 500 submissions from residents into that process. And we play a similar role every year during the budget engagement process, where we do deputations in town halls and working with coalitions of local agencies and residents to make sure that community voices are heard in the process. And most recently, we facilitated a process for community leaders and local agencies to lead resident consultations to inform the Toronto Office of Recovery and Rebuild's final report, which hopefully is coming out in a few weeks. And what that meant was 175 of some of the strongest community leaders across the city applied for honorarium support and worked with us. And collectively, they consulted with 1,374 residents from communities that have been directly impacted by the pandemic. So we kind of function as a bridging organization in that we work closely with the city, and we know how to do that, but we also have strong relationships and networks of grassroots leaders who also know and trust SPT. And it is those grassroots leaders and those local agencies who are best positioned to directly engage the residents from their own communities. So it's sort of a series of bridges of trust and relationships, from the residents to the grassroots leaders within their communities and the community ambassadors, to SPT and other bridging organizations, to the city. And that's not to say that there aren't also direct channels for residents to engage with the city. Of course, there are many, but we often help to provide some additional engagement support in places where it's needed.
Amazing, thank you so much. Going over to Anthony.
Hi, folks, good afternoon. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to participate in this really important conversation. And so it also pains me to say I can't stay for the full conversation. Something really pressing has come up. I'm the manager of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. And as some of you would know, I imagine some of you have been brought to this conversation because you understand the ways in which anti-Black racism can manifest and does manifest within the lives of Torontonians. And unfortunately, there's something that has come up that requires a response. But to answer the immediate question before I go, for the purposes of this conversation, what I think is important to share is that for us in the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, which is the only office of its kind in North America that is focused specifically on addressing anti-Black racism in policy, planning, practices, and even now with recent decisions that have come down from City Council to the point of municipal governance and finance, we're an office that's uniquely situated, and what we have to support us in our work is what's referred to as a partnership and accountability circle. Now, this is a group of 12 Black Torontonians that serve to make sure that we as an office remain connected to community, that we have the richest, most immediate information about what are some of the pressing challenges and issues that are happening. And then we also ensure that those 12 folks are plugged into different decision-making channels of the city. Everything from looking into a division, supporting a division and looking for a new CEO, to helping with supporting programming that's more reflective and inclusive of Toronto's Black communities. For some context, Black communities represent some 7.5% of the City of Toronto's overall population. And so in numbers, that's more than 440,000, according to the 2016 census. And so with our office being grounded in the Toronto Action Plan to Confront Anti-Black Racism, we can only do our work with the rich voices and experiences and a diverse range and an intersectional range of Black experiences. So regularly connecting and grounding with Black queer communities, Black faith communities, elderly folks, young people, folks living with disabilities, newcomers, and so forth. And again, I am running this off very quickly, unfortunately. This is not what I planned to say, but I want to leave you folks with some sense of what the office does, how we work, and you can certainly check us out online. I am so sorry to the organizers, Brittany and the rest of you amazing panelists. I'm terribly sorry, but yeah, unfortunately this was being told there's no choice in the matter. We've got to run. And so I'm looking forward to catching the conversation after it happens, and hopefully we can do this again in some other way. But to learn more about the Toronto Action Plan to Confront Anti-Black Racism and the ways in which we are including more Black voices in decision-making, everything from the conversation around defunding police and finding alternative services to how we are resourcing programming in the context of COVID, please check out our website at toronto.ca/ABR. And I apologize, folks. I'm wishing you all the best. Take care.
No worries. So I am going to attempt to fill in some of the shoes that Anthony is leaving kind of open for me. As I'm very well versed in the work of what's happening at the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. So I will also be hoping to provide that lens as well. So thank you. So we're running on a really tight schedule here, so I really want to make sure that we cover all our bases. So given your respective professions and the work that you all do, we know that good policy making is always informed by the information that we have before us. So what data or information are we currently missing in order to be inclusive and to make evidence-based policy decisions? What information is, and also what information isn't being sufficiently used currently right now in policy making, and how can we fill those gaps? So this is what I would like and hope is to have a conversation around how do we start making better decisions overall. We currently have, you know, some processes in place as it relates to consultations, as it relates to, you know, showing up at deputations, and as it relates to, you know, contacting maybe your local representative formally. But what needs to be put in place for all of us working within the formal structure at, let's say, City Hall or within the bureaucracy, but also those who work in the number of institutions, what do we need in place in order to make better decisions? And I'm going to go to Trisha on this one.
Okay. It's a really good question, and the basic point about how, you know, decisions are made based on the information we have. And I think there are two issues. One you flagged is really important, which is that policymakers are often missing information. And I think in other areas they have too much information, and so there's an imbalance. I think policymakers, I'm thinking specifically of the city here, are missing you know, a lot of information about what some communities want, and they're missing some information about the very basic, practical, like even logistical realities of daily life for those communities. Those are, as you've put it, I know in talks you've given, Brittany, there's just stories of the city that they don't know, and they're just not getting through, both in city council and in various departments, including, I'm thinking of Heather's work, like, you know, planning. And at the same time, I think they have too much information and get too much information about what property owning, largely white and fairly well-to-do residents who live in detached housing and drive a lot. I think we know what they want, and there's almost too much information about that perspective, those lives, that reality. Mm-hmm. And I think what we need are more formal structures. There are some, as you've noted, in place around consultation, a little uneven, but more formal structures that elevate and include the voices of the stories and the communities we don't know, or that they can't hear, despite the fact that a lot of those communities are shouting. But also things that you know, correct that imbalance and mute a little bit the communities that are largely the backgrounds of people in those offices, and the ones that, you know, have the resources to be the noisiest.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth for us to start naming some of these communities that, you know, are not necessarily included. So I'm going to be really specific here. Black communities within the city, I would say Indigenous communities, urban Indigenous communities, which is, you know, not very visible within Toronto, but I wouldn't say there is a strong voice on the local level in terms of integrating some of our policy decisions to reflect the concerns of those communities. And even when I think about consultations, we often hear that we do consultations too much, or communities are over-consulted. And I think you touch on a really great point there, Trisha, is that we know too much of some information and not enough of others. So it forces us to think through, what are we consulting on? Because consultations is obviously a very good and useful tool, but have we used it to, you know, too much in certain areas and not enough in other areas? And you talk about the day-to-day life, I'm thinking immediately when somebody who lives in a community that I'm considering has a number of different, you know, faces marginalization, a number of different issues, what does their 9 to 9 look like? When they get up 7 o'clock in the morning, they make their way, whether it's to the bus stop or to their parking lot, their commute, where they're working, what their childcare or education maybe situation is like, to maybe how did they get back home, and how much money they're making in between there, that all those things influence or impact one's ability to participate within our system of governance, but also, you know, can skew some of the information that we're actually looking to receive. So that's why I really want to go to Devika, because I know, you know, Social Planning Toronto really focuses on amplifying civic participation. So what do you think we need to do in order to strengthen the work in this regard?
Yeah, so I mean, what I was going to say is, you know, what I think is missing, if we could hire, hypothetically, like a professional pollster to consult with residents on every issue that requires input, and their job was to speak to a representative sample based on the actual demographics of our city, I think the information that you would get would be vastly different than what comes to the city right now through existing engagement channels. And when we say it's not representative, I don't only mean that the city is hearing from the wealthier white residents in neighborhood associations and the homeowners and that sort of thing, or the business improvement areas for whom these channels are quite easy to navigate. But I also mean that the city's hearing from the progressive activist organizations like ours that are able to create that noise. And the issue is that politicians and the public service know that there's this big mushy middle in between those two ends of the spectrum that they're not hearing from. And so as an example, when you think about the city budget engagement process, city councilors know that there's going to be turnout from specific categories of special interest groups. You know, they're expecting people to come and talk about climate and the ravine strategy, and they're expecting people that Social Planning Toronto has engaged to show up. But I've had some councilors actually say to me off the record that they know that what they hear during those deputations is not representative of what the majority of the residents in their ward think and feel. But then they have that, they know that, but they at the same time have that sort of information vacuum. So they're making guesses about what people want, and sometimes those guesses are the wrong guesses. So to me, the solution has much more to do with doing more of what the city has already started doing in some places. And what that means is really proactively reaching out to the voices that we already know face barriers to civic participation and that are in that mushy middle. And so just like we talk about hiring practices for leadership level positions through an equity lens, or we talk about, you know, recruitment to boards through an equity lens, we need to design our civic engagement practices also through an equity lens. And so the goal would be to get as close a representation as possible of what would have come back if we were engaging professional pollsters for input on the key issues. And maybe we should actually start using professional pollsters a little bit more, but also making use of civic engagement technology, especially now during the pandemic when more and more of life is moving online, to get that more accurate representation. But of course, recognizing that you also have to address the technology barriers. And so to do that proactive work, I mean, there are instances I've seen, as Tricia said, it's very uneven. There's instances where I've seen that, you know, that is completely not the approach that the city took, and other places where they did. So for example, with this recent Toronto Office of Recovery and Rebuild work, we pushed on that, right? We saw that they had engaged the Toronto Board of Trade to launch extensive consultations to inform their recommendations to City Council. And it was a perfect example of how existing channels leave out the voices of marginalized residents. So we pushed and negotiated an agreement where we could enlist grassroots leaders and organizations to consult with residents in their community, and we're able to provide some honorarium support to engage people. And so it's important for civil society organizations to keep pushing for those things. And then there are many examples, I can point to many examples where the city independently did do that proactive outreach and incorporate it into the work they were doing. I think the housing TO consultations were a good example of that being very well done. I know right now Parks, Forestry and Recreation is engaging community in decisions about where to build the next 10 youth hubs that it got funding for in the last budget. And social development, finance, and administration at the City of Toronto really does deserve a shout out for their leadership in engaging with residents who are often the most excluded from governance. And you know, really a lot of other parts of the city should follow their lead. It's not perfect, but you have to start somewhere, and they've built an excellent foundation.
Amazing, thank you. And Heather, what are your thoughts on this?
I can only echo what Patricia and Devika have said. They've raised really good points. I guess if I was going to, you know, really reflect on this question, you know, there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to gathering additional data and hearing from communities that we're not hearing from, hearing perspectives that you know, we're not hearing about and that aren't part of decision-making processes right now. But I also wonder, you know, so we can gather information on how things are. But I also think, you know, if we're talking about radically changing governance structures, looking for new modes of governing and decision-making, what kind of data, what kind of information do we need to think differently about how things could be? And there, I think there's probably a whole host of untapped information from communities and from other sources that, you know, that might serve as a source of inspiration. You know, one thing I've been thinking about is the land acknowledgements that are performed at the beginning of nearly every public event, right? They're often performed, and that's a good thing, but often that they stop at the end of that recitation. And yet I think these are invitations to think deeply about governance and governance processes. These land acknowledgements often acknowledge the treaties that have been enacted on these territories, but that also implicate communities within the City of Toronto and beyond the City of Toronto boundaries. And they really, I think, demand thinking seriously about governance, because these treaties are informed by Indigenous legal orders and different forms of governance that could be sources of inspiration. So I think there's a other question there as well. Like, what do we need? What information do we need to understand what's happening right now? But also, where do we look to get new ideas and new ways of thinking about how things might be done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this moment calls for some creativity. I love the fact that you talked about why are we not thinking about getting pollsters into communities or having more targeted approach. I think that's really key and crucial. And even thinking through other models of participation that exist to get information. You know, participatory budgeting is a form of that because it does involve resident participation, and you know, there's some demographic information that's used in there as well. But how can we amplify that? And if so, I know we had a model, a pilot project here in Toronto, but we haven't had any full, robust conversation around what are some of the big learnings? What can we do better? What can we not do better? How can we, you know, given that cities across North America are actually going in that direction, what would force Toronto to move backwards? So I think those are some really important questions for us to ask. And then also even it resurfaces a conversation around community councils, right? And the role that they could possibly play in terms of accessing data or even just getting more, I would say, knowledge around the populations that we serve. With the COVID crisis, I mean, anybody who, you know, knows some of the deep inequities that exist in Toronto, it's no surprise that residents in the northwest end of the city were the people that were faced with, that were hit the hardest. So what could we have done beforehand to maybe have prevented this? So how do we start thinking a bit more in terms of being proactive to prevent crises? I think that's really critical as well. So I'm gonna kind of pass it over to the next question. As we're starting to think through processes and, you know, getting creative in terms of the process, what do you think are the consequences of not having, you know, I would say a good participatory structure or even a good structure for getting more data to make good policy decisions? What are some of the consequences that could result from that?
Brittany, I just want to jump in to say there's one other issue, which is, you know, we've been talking about getting those voices heard, but the other piece of it is that when those voices are heard, they're not weighted equally, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the other piece of what we need to think through is, you know, first getting government to be really honest about what the window of opportunity to actually influence an outcome is, because nothing makes my blood boil more than when I see consultations being conducted by government in a performative way, and meanwhile the recommendations have already been determined and they just check it off on a box to say that engagement is done. So I think, you know, that's also a really key role for media and for civil society organizations to push on how is that input reflected. You heard X, Y, and Z from these people, from these communities. How is that reflected in the decisions you made? And constantly creating that pressure so that there's an increasing public understanding about when government is and isn't actually sharing power with people and building that accountability. But, you know, just I'll let others answer the question you actually asked, but I just wanted to add that piece of it.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I'm going to add to that. What policy areas would be most impacted if we did have, I would say, these participatory structures or some really great data that's being collected through our processes? What policy areas would we see the best outcomes within? Do you think, Trisha? I'm going to go to Trisha first.
It's hard to think of an area that would be unaffected, honestly. I mean, like, if you think about it, like, a starting place for an urban geographer is that the city is the way it is by design, like not by accident. And so the inequalities that we see, you know, manifested in the geography of the city that are now showing up in the worst of all possible ways in terms of the impact of illness and death from this pandemic, right? But that those are not accidental, and we have systems in place that keep that inequity in place, even if it's not an explicit goal. It's systemic, it's built into it, and it is produced exactly as you framed it, you know, by the knowledge we have and don't have, and as Heather was saying, even by the kinds of information that we seek and don't seek. You know, what do we need, the idea of what do we need to know, you know, to make such and such a decision. In fact, I was thinking as Heather was speaking, we've been talking about communities, but of course, one of my own central questions in my project is, you know, what are our obligations to this place and this land and the environment and that relationship, and how do we gather information and listen to that? Do we have someone speak for it? Are there other ways we think about it? But those aren't always questions that we ask. But if in terms of like, what are the consequences for policy, it's really everywhere. And thinking specifically about Toronto, you know, this failure to be more inclusive in governance shows up in, you know, the quality of public space, particularly in terms of accessibility and experience in the public realm. It shows up in mobility across the city, which has a powerful impact on anyone's, especially economic, as well as social well-being. It shows up in housing. It shows up in policing. It shows up overall, I think, in the priorities that the city, in terms of city council, has. It shows up in their comfort in terms of policy outcomes, in terms of their comfort in privatized solutions. And I would say that all of those areas, you see like really visible weaknesses in Toronto, where it's had an impact. And if we could make it more inclusive, there's a possibility for a ripple effect of positive, more positive outcomes.
Yeah, if I can add there, if we're thinking about impacts, I think a very big impact when these perspectives are not taken into account is an erosion of trust and faith in these public processes, in governance processes. You know, in July, we saw Metrolinx renege on its promise to donate land for a community center in the Jane Finch neighborhood. And this was promised as part of compensation for building a large rail garage in that neighborhood, and was part of community benefit agreement discussions and consultations about construction projects being driven by Metrolinx. And I can't imagine I can't imagine the impact that that's going to have, right? That people are not going to trust promises made by Metrolinx or other transit organizations when we're in desperate need of new transport projects. You know, my colleague Dale Turner says that consultation is what you get when you combine a con with an insult. You get consultation. So these kinds of broken processes, I think, really illustrate, these broken promises illustrate why it's so important to think about these governance processes and think about maybe different processes altogether, rather than just making amendments to existing processes.
So then how do we, this is a question that's being proposed, we currently have a council that has about 25 seats, was recently cut in half. We are currently in a crisis that really has forced the city to rely on federal funding, provincial funding, given the fact that it has lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue over the past, what's going on, 6-7 months now. what can we do right now to ensure that the processes that we have in place don't worsen some of the situations that I've outlined? And what do you think we need to add in order to get the city and our processes and our governance model back on track? I'm gonna ask Trisha.
I think we need changes at multiple levels. So in the more practical and specific, speaking to some of what you mentioned, I think we need to change the way we, not just the way we do public consultation, but the way we invite public commentary. And the most common form is deputation to committee, which is currently not a very accessible process. And we allow councillors to question deputants, and they are very badly behaved, and sometimes so is the mayor. So that has to stop. I mean, we have to change the way the city interacts with its citizens. I think we need to provide better municipal information and services on a more local level, even at the neighborhood level. I think we need to increase the number of councillors so we don't have the worst municipal representation in the world. But I also think we need to think about new structures, including possibly multi-member wards that would be more representative and more responsive to their communities. I think we need more connection. I think we need to, between, I'm thinking especially of like civil society organizations, as Devika has said, and city councillors, but also staff, bureaucrats. And I think we need to fundamentally restructure the way we do public consultation so it's more meaningful and inclusive. But more deeply, and a little less specifically, I guess in some ways, we really need to fundamentally change this city and its geography. I really feel strongly that we need to improve public space in every way, and by this I really fundamentally mean to make it more just and more accessible in every way, so that people really have a right to belong, to participate, to make claims, and to never doubt that they do, and never be made to feel that they don't. I would hope that, as you've noted, that recent events have, and activism around them have really helped those who have not been able to understand just how vicious the experience of this city is for some people in some communities who are, systematically and systemically excluded. And just how much work there is to do and how urgent it is to do it. I mean, when you were mentioning, let's think specifically, some of the folks that I have spoken to in this research are those who work with trans youth, especially those who are precariously housed, many of whom are also racialized. And they are extraordinarily vulnerable in every single way. And the city serves them almost not at all, like beyond these civil society organizations. Like the vulnerability of some communities, it needs a real transformation of the city to really make space for them and make them believe they belong.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to actually ask Devika this question in regards to how do we actually start the process of, I would maybe say, introducing community councils. So there's this kind of tension that exists between the idea of either institutionalizing activism, meaning institutionalizing the way people participate and engage with government and raise decisions or bring decisions to the forefront, versus how do we ensure that public pressure that allows for different decisions to be made can still be had. So there's different, I would say, theories of change when it comes to those two, I would say, decisions to influence policy. But how do you think we can start the process of implementing or getting off the ground community councils? And what do you think their impact could be in, I would say, some of the low-income communities that exist in Toronto who could really greatly benefit from having a say over some decisions at City Hall?
Yeah, so as you said, I mean, the community council idea and leveraging community councils and building that, I've heard pros and cons, right? I've heard, exactly as you described, that, it's a way to add a layer to the system of governance so that the right voices are heard. But on the other hand, it really runs the risk of replicating all the barriers that exist right now and all the other layers. And I mean, there are a million solutions on participatory budgeting. I've heard pros and cons. On term limits, I've heard pros and cons. On, I mean, there's a long list of things. Permanent residents having the right to vote in municipal elections. All of these things. I think what I worry about is that if we don't actually truly consult the public on all of these ideas that have been put forward, we are never actually going to move to any place of action. So it's almost it's an oxymoron for thought leaders and community organizing people to be having these conversations about what the solutions are, about how to avoid this situation, right? So what I actually think is required, because unless we have a strong mandate from a majority of Torontonians to implement specific solutions, we'll forever be talking to each other. Councillors will forever be debating term limits or no term limits. So what I think actually needs to be done is what actually Tricia and myself and 40 other people called for during last year's Special Committee on Governance, which is take this seriously, a 2-year consultation process, similar to what the City of Edmonton did, that consults with thousands of residents, that proactively reaches those equity-seeking groups, people from vulnerable communities, that puts forward all of these ideas that we're talking about, ranked ballots, participatory budgeting, term limits, this, that, and actually tries to identify where is the majority of public opinion at on each of these things, including your original question, Brittany, about community councils and leveraging that, or neighborhood pods, all of the different local governance structures, so that we can no longer keep punting it back and forth, and we actually have a clear mandate from a majority of Torontonians to say, okay, of all the ideas that are out there, these 5 have, good traction, and therefore there's no excuse not to move forward and implement it. So, we were asking for a community advisory body to design and guide this engagement process, and we said it needed to include academic thought leaders like Tricia, it needed to include community leaders, it needs to include the city manager's office, and specifically in there, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, the Indigenous Affairs Office, the Gender Equality Office, as well as the city clerk's office, and of course SDF&A. All of those players need to be at the table to design a consultation process that is legitimate. Last year, the consultation process that they actually used was patronizing and tokenistic. About 40 or 50 people were engaged. None of the input had anything to do with the outcomes, and that shouldn't be the case. We are long overdue for a governance review.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think about, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, they have what's called a community circle, or a community accountability partnership circle. And they have members from Black members from different parts of the community who are actually review decisions before they come out of City Hall to ensure that these decisions reflect, the needs and concerns of those in their community. Now that's it's a formal/informal structure that exists within the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, but I can see something like that being really useful within our own individual wards before taking that full step to kind of integrate a permanent kind of community council-like model. So I think that would be interesting. I think we're often afraid of taking little steps in terms of not wanting to make a big commitment to some of the big changes, but there has to be kind of, I think, a starting place of really getting around to the idea that you gotta start somewhere, is what I'd like to say. So we have about 10 more minutes left. I really want to leave some room right now to have a really quick conversation, or a few points to discuss some of the things that I think cities are reacting to right now in this moment. And that is primarily right now, obviously, the calls to defund policing, but that is also a call to really look at public safety and how, some of the spending dollars spending that's existing in city, how much of that is going to policing and how much of that should go elsewhere. So as people who are, working on the city level in a variety of different professions, I'm going to go to you, Heather, first, and maybe you can take about a minute to do this. How do you think that we should be responding to this call? I think most people can operate from the premise that policing takes up quite a large proportion of city budget. But how do we ensure that we are now thinking through public safety in the lens of, I would say, not having policing that harms Black and Indigenous lives, but also other people on the spectrum of marginalization? How do we ensure that we're creating a more, I would say, safe public safety model?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think that's a question that really needs its own conversation involving a lot of different people. But I think fundamentally what this moment is showing us is that people cannot participate in inclusive governance when they are preoccupied with questions of survival. So we need to prioritize, our governance needs to prioritize addressing systemic racism in employment and housing and education and healthcare, because all of this is a co-requisite to survival and it's a co-requisite to inclusive governance. You know, over the past few decades, we've seen the defunding of public housing, of mental health services, of support for people with disabilities. And so I think it's just time to defund the police and redirect those funds towards those things that are going to help people live healthier lives. Because if we want inclusive governance, that is going to be a big part of implementing that.
Mm-hmm. Trisha, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I strongly agree. I mean, as I was talking about earlier about the need for a real transformation of the public realm and a real investment in it, that includes a lot of, you know, basic tangible investments, but it also must include reduced policing, especially what we might call it reduced sort of social policing or policing of social activity in the public realm. I don't understand why we haven't banned carding as a practice, period. That's just a decision that's long overdue, especially in the city of Toronto, but obviously it should be province-wide. I think we need to recognize just how uneven access to public spaces, just the ability to be in them, to be social in them, how uneven that is for different residents of the city, and how much people get moved along and don't have anywhere to just be. And we cannot move forward and have, as Heather was saying, it's the foundation for any kind of participation. It's a foundation for feeling like, yes, I can be in this city, and therefore I have something to say about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thank you. So I'm going to go to some of the questions that were posed. So the one I want to pose to you all, I mean, many can be in this conversation. A lot of us have a great deal, I would say, of influence, our ability to shape conversations, and our ability to contact those in power. So what do you think is the most important part of kind of changing our governance model? So the question is, how important do you think allyship is to changing policies and engagement practices to be more inclusive? So when I think about allyship, how can maybe all of us use some of the power that we hold in the grand scheme of things to start to shift and change our governance practices to be more inclusive? So this is maybe a lightning speed. So I'm going to Devika first, maybe take about 10 seconds, and then Trisha, and then Heather.
I think we need to invest redirect much more of our resources and efforts in convincing each other of these positions, rather than before we direct it to decision makers, because they're just going to flip right back to where's public opinion at on a given issue. And often it's not where we need it to be to influence them.
Okay, thank you. Trisha?
Well, speaking specifically of academia and the role that it can play, you know, a lot of us, especially with tenure, but you know, have access to spaces that that sort of, I don't know, connote authority, and there are just as many issues about who has access to those spaces, which, you know, we're very actively tackling right now. So I think, but those in academia, especially with the kind of job security that I have, you know, everything that they can do to leverage that space and leverage that authority in the interests of more than you know, a narrow slice of people, and to expand, even as getting back to Heather's point, to expand even what we mean by information research and expertise. Like this is we have a lot of independence and autonomy and privilege that we could be leveraging towards that.
Thank you. Heather?
Yeah, I think allyship is really crucial. I mean, I'm thinking of allyship pretty broadly here, thinking about how people come to common decisions, right? And that's, I think, a big part of what we're talking about.
Definitely. And last 2 questions. So I'm going to actually pose this question to Trisha, if you can take about 15 seconds to answer this. I think this is a really important one. Nothing maintains the status quo better than engaging outside participants on a final draft of a policy. How do we promote a shift to community empowerment? So not presenting community with a final draft that's basically almost finalized, but how do we get people earlier on in the stages of this process?
Yeah, I strongly believe in it. Breeds so much cynicism, and as David was saying, makes my blood boil as well to witness. What I would like to see in the City of Toronto is some kind of charter on public consultation, like a set of guidelines, a set of rules that have to be followed for various projects, and that these projects are held accountable. Other cities have this, where there's a set of rules about who has to be consulted and how. It's not always come to us, but we go to you, how much, how representative, and so on. And that if that work hasn't been done, the project doesn't go forward. That you actually put some teeth into the consultation and hold decision makers accountable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so as we wrap up, everybody, thank you so much for participating, for your questions, and also for being here today. I'm gonna give the last word to my fellow panelists, and I'm gonna ask them, what is one thing that you would like to see change in the next 2 years to help achieve more inclusive governance in Toronto? One thing only. Heather.
I'm stuck now.
Okay, I'll go to Trisha and I'll come back to you. Trisha, what's one thing that you would like to see changed?
I think I probably just answered it. I mean, in terms of like, if we, something you can do easily, it would be some kind of a charter on public consultation, actual rules with teeth. It would not be expensive or difficult to implement, it just requires the will. Something could be put in pretty quickly and could make a difference in a pretty immediate way.
Amazing. Devika?
I've also said it already. I want that 2-year consultation process launched ASAP.
Okay. Heather, should I come back to you on this?
Sure. I think I've also already said it, which is defunding the police and redirecting those funds towards other kinds of services.
And I guess I'll wrap it up and say that I personally would like to see more community-driven processes. When it comes to defunding the police, I think if that is actually a policy proposal that we would like to seriously consider, it needs to start in the places where people experience policing the most, but also experience other forms of violence. So they absolutely need to be involved in the consultation process. So it makes me rethink about who we're consulting, and I don't think we are actually consulting those who live in Toronto community housing nearly enough as maybe we consult those who live in the neighborhood that I live in, which is in Midtown. So thinking through where are the hidden neighborhoods within our cities, and how can we work to ensure that we are actually placing ourselves in those communities and being really direct with the people that we're seeking out and that we want to be a part of this process. So thank you, everyone. I really hope that this maybe got us thinking a little bit through about how our governance systems and processes can be amplified. The Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit is actually the first of its kind in North America, and we've seen offices replicated in Ottawa. There's a similar office that's operating in Nova Scotia, and I think there's something similar that's happening in Edmonton or Alberta as well. So that is a really interesting model that obviously works to challenge anti-Black racism within the city, that's instituted within our governance model. Now, to see what the outcomes of that office will be, obviously that's something that we're going to see 2 to 3, maybe even 5 to 10 years down the line. But I think it's really important for us to start thinking through what are the systems that we need to set in place to achieve good policy outcomes 20, 30 years down the line. So maybe if there is another pandemic, and I hope there's not, that we can that we would have things in place that wouldn't have produced the sort of outcomes we've seen today. So thank you so much. And we hope to see you again at another panel. So take care, everybody.
And I would just like to come in to thank our panel and our moderator, Brittany, and especially Brittany because you stepped in for Anthony as well. I think we've just scratched the surface on some of these topics, and we at IMFG have worked on public consultation and participatory budgeting and votes for permanent residents and ranked ballots and some of these topics before. But I think, the panel has really stressed the importance of having all voices heard. And that's a really important part of what we're talking about today. We need more information, but mostly we need to change the way we do public consultation. So we will keep working on this. Thank you all. Devika, Patricia, Heather, Anthony for his opening comments, and especially to you, Brittany, for moderating. This event has been recorded today, so if you loved it, you can listen to it again, but you can also share it with your colleagues who couldn't attend today. Thank you all for attending and hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.